Hi, I'm Dan from SkyPilot FaithQuest podcasts and videos, and I'm glad you're here. Last week we discussed the viewpoint held by some Christians that Jesus had no siblings at all, and we investigated that because the Bible seems to imply that he did. This week we take up the viewpoint of an entirely different group. This group says, he had siblings, and he had one who was close, really close to his age. All of this we'll discuss on the way to answering the very unlikely question this week: was Jesus a twin? Welcome to the SkyPilot podcast that explores questions of faith, spirituality, and religion. I'm Dan Matthews, and I don't have all the answers, but I do enjoy the questions. Welcome to the podcast where every question is an invitation into a spiritual quest, and you're invited along for the journey. Okay, before we get started, do me a favor and please like, subscribe, and ring that magical bell. It will really help me get noticed with the mysterious algorithms of YouTube. Look, there are several categories into which the episodes of this podcast fall. One type of episode that I have done quite a bit would be one in which we explore some little-known fact about religion that you might have never known, but we reveal to you here, like the actually Christian origin of the words hocus pocus. Sometimes there are episodes that I think of as kind of the gospel according to Dan, and these are in no way outside the realm of normal Christianity, but I give you my interpretation of what I believe about the Christian faith, or what works for me, or has worked for me on my spiritual journey. There's an episode called Are Religion, Faith, and Spirituality the Same? I think that was in the 130s or something like that. And it very much falls into this category. You get a heavy dose of what I believe and what has worked for me. Then there's some educational episodes on elements of other faiths. I've done some on Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, and these are really just an effort to help us all be more knowledgeable. It's not in any way trying to make you become Jewish or Islam or Buddhist, or even are any of my videos really intended to make you Christian. They're all just intended to help you learn something that maybe you didn't know before, or think about something that you hadn't thought about before. But, and this is really the point today, then sometimes we delve into a topic that seems bizarre, fanciful, and totally out of left field, like today's topic, where we look at the theory that Jesus maybe had a brother, a twin brother. Wait for it, an identical twin brother. Okay, maybe I should make something perfectly clear here. I know it'll probably be more dramatic if I saved all of this to the end, and there are things that probably would work out better for dramatic effect left to the end, but I'm going to tell you things probably as you want to know them as we go along, because I think you may find it more interesting, or at very least there are going to be people who find it more comforting to know these things before they get started. So the very first one that needs to be said is there is nothing here that's trying to prove to you that this theory is true. And that isn't because it's totally pulled from a world of fanciful make-believe and nonsense. No, there are people who are very much real Christians who also very much believe that Jesus did indeed have a twin brother.
Oh, you can probably find 10 people who are convinced that Jesus was a giraffe.
First, not sure that I could. And second, if I could, I would absolutely wind up doing an episode about that. Well, just because you don't believe it, or you haven't heard about it, does not mean there aren't segments of the Christian faith community that very much believe this. So just chalk this episode up to learning something unusual and interesting that you may not have known about Christianity before today, and let go of the idea that you have to make a decision about whether this is part of your faith. You're just learning something. Let's start with this question, because it's always a good place to start. Is this biblical? Well, it would be really nice if the answer were just yes or no, but like a lot of questions we look at in these episodes, the answer could be either not entirely or kind of depends on who you ask.
Hold on. If Jesus had a twin, much more an identical twin, I think there would be some mention of that in Scripture, don't you? I mean, it seems like a pretty important detail to just forget to add to any of the Gospels.
Well, actually, there is a clue that's not exactly hiding even in the Gospel of John. According to the theory, Jesus' twin brother was one of the 12 apostles and is none other than Thomas. So let's look for some clues. And the obvious place to start is the Gospel of John, because the Gospel of John has the most famous story about Thomas that any of us know. John 20, 24 through 27. I'll read it to you now. But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them, and although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Okay, I know this isn't kind of the absolute, total, convincing evidence that you might hope for exactly.
No, it's not. It's exactly the opposite of that. The Bible clearly states that Jesus had 4 brothers, who you even named in your last episode. They are James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. If Thomas the twin is all the biblical evidence that you have for Jesus' twin, then the case is closed. There's no brother named Thomas, so Jesus does not have a twin, and I just proved it because the Bible says so.
Yeah, about that. Let's start there. I'll get straight to the point. Evidently, Thomas wasn't his name. Or more specifically, Thomas isn't even a name. It's not actually a name at all. So the Aramaic word for twin was Toma. When the word Toma went from Aramaic to Greek, Aramaic being the language that the disciples spoke, and then Greek, which was the language used to write down the New Testament, when it went from Aramaic to Greek, an S was added to the word, as often happened, evidently, when a word was transliterated to Greek from a foreign language. So Toma became Thomas in Greek, and then transliterated into English, then became what we know as Thomas. So the first interesting thing we learn in search of Jesus's twin and the story around that is that the person who people believe to have been his twin isn't even named here. Interestingly, if we look at a specific piece of the text from the passage of John that we just read, we see this. But Thomas, who was called the twin. So now, knowing what we know about ancient languages, this passage actually says, but the twin, who was called the twin. So according to those who believe in the Jesus had a twin theory, Thomas is Jesus's twin. But let me say, we don't start there. There's more to this than just that single passage.
Well, obviously, I mean, how stupid would it be to create a whole episode based on just this?
Okay, first, we don't say stupid. There are better, more productive words that we can use.
Like moronic, foolish, unintelligent, imbecilic, senseless, dim-witted.
Okay, I should have just left it at stupid. So let's look at that passage from John again with the idea that these two, Jesus and Thomas, were brothers. No, I'm not making an argument in favor of this being the case, but that doesn't mean that we can't take this idea and have some fun with it, seeing if it gives us a new, different, strange, interesting lens to look at this passage.
Or rather than new or different or strange, how about moronic, foolish, unintelligent, imbecilic, senseless, dim-witted?
Okay. Anyway, so one of the interesting things about the interaction between Thomas and Jesus is that, well, it couldn't have been lost on you. It's pretty graphic. Have you ever seen that famous painting by Caravaggio depicting this particular moment, this interaction between Jesus and Thomas? As I said, even the picture's pretty graphic. Well, I'll just put it up for you right now. Thomas, as you can see, is leaning over with his face just inches away from the wound in Jesus' side, and he's dipping his finger in it. You can't help but look at it and ask, who would actually do this? And despite the depiction by Caravaggio, I can't imagine that there would have been several of the disciples, several of those guys coming in close to share the moment. It seems like one of those where everyone would have turned away because, well, it's just so darn gross. I'm thinking the other disciples would have said, nope, no, sir, not me. I'm good. This is your moment, Thomas. You enjoy it. Yet this moment between Jesus and Thomas feels exactly like the kind of exchange that would have happened between identical twin brothers. Now, let me just take a moment to explain that. If you've ever known identical twins, their comfort with each other, their familiarity with each other can make their interaction sometimes, well, just a little too much, too intense for people who are around them who don't know them well or didn't grow up with them. The interaction between Jesus and Thomas in this passage does kind of seem exactly like the kind of thing that twins would do.
Okay, enough of this. Exactly who is it that says Jesus has a twin?
So there are some non-biblical traditions revolving around Thomas. Stop before you scream, non-biblical. We can take nothing that is non-biblical seriously. Anytime we talk about faith issues, it can only be the Bible alone that we reference. Okay, let's just take a step back for a moment. In the Bible, there are 14 apostles in total. I know 12 is what you know. You are correct. There were the 12 original ones. But then remember, Judas died, and they replaced him with Matthias. Then Paul came along, who wasn't a part of the original group. He did not know Jesus during his earthly ministry. But Paul, because of his unique conversion experience, was allowed to call himself an apostle. Paul seems to be the only other person ever allowed to use that designation of apostle. Of these 14, the church has generally understood that we know how all 14 died. But that information is actually only biblical in its origin for 2 of the 14. The rest are known only through tradition and other ancient writings. Okay, let me give you an example, or a couple of examples. Peter was crucified upside down. You probably know that. Paul was beheaded by Nero. Okay. Paul was not personally beheaded by Nero, but it was under his reign. John is generally understood to be the only apostle to have died of natural causes. Now, these 3 stories, as often I've heard them cited as fact, all of these I just told you come from non-biblical sources. None of them are in the Bible. So we have very little information about Thomas from the Bible. Some of what we know about him comes from traditions that are outside our Bible sources. Now, my point here is not that this therefore must be true. My point here is encouraging us to refrain from a knee-jerk reaction, refusing to even listen to a story, when in reality it comes from sources that are no less reputable than some of the other stories that, well, we love to tell each other in church. Now, am I arguing that Jesus had a twin? No. I'm not. I don't find this story to be compelling. I just would stop short of feeling the need to judge people for believing the stories with which they grew up. You know, just like the way you and I like to believe the stories with which we grew up. Now, we today have copies of a book that was in some level of circulation by the end of the 3rd century. The Acts of Thomas is what it's called. And we don't exactly know the date of its writing, but somewhere before the year 240, it had been written. Also, this is not to be confused with the other similarly named book called The Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is mostly a collection of sayings, whereas the Acts of Thomas, the one we're talking about now, is the story of Thomas's missionary work in India, India being the traditional place where Thomas is said to have died. There's also another book that is relevant here, and it's called The Acts of Thecla. That uses the idea of Jesus as an identical twin to make some of its most important theological points. The basic idea here is this. Jesus had a twin named Jude or Judas. Now, before you say, oh, we don't know what he was named, they both are slightly different translations of the exact same name. So it was Jude, according to tradition, that was the one called the twin. So according to those who believe this, Thomas and Jude are one and the same. By some traditions, the identical twin was more than just a brother who looked like Jesus, who looked a lot like Jesus. Okay, who looked exactly like Jesus. Being Jesus's identical twin, he seemed in some traditions to have some of Jesus's supernatural powers as well. And in other stories, it seems that Jesus is the holy brother and Thomas is the earthly brother, and there's a very intentional dichotomy that's used to play the two of them off against each other when their stories are told. Either way, within certain elements of Christianity in India, the idea of Thomas being Jesus's twin brother still remains strong. Look, there are those who want to experience their faith in very defined ways. They feel, I know all I need to know, and that means I don't need to know anything more. And therefore, for some of those folks, stuff like this is kind of threatening. I think those people approach their faith very much the way that I approached my economics or history exams in college. I spent the night cramming all the useful information I could into my admittedly limited capacity. And all I wanted to do when it came time for the exam was I wanted to walk from my dorm to the exam without anyone even speaking to me, without anyone giving me anything else to think about or to process or to put in my brain. So say I'm walking along to the exam and someone sees me and goes, hey, Dan, guess what I heard? There's going to be a party this weekend. Do you want to? And I'm like, Nope, sorry, no. I can't take anything else in. I can't be part of a conversation. I am carefully holding all I can right now in my brain. See you on the other side of the exam. We can talk about whatever you want to talk about then. And I think there are people who approach their faith like that. They have learned all they can and all they believe they need to know. And until that moment comes after the exam, meaning until they are in heaven, don't confuse them with more information. And so stories like this can be very overwhelming, intimidating. Nope, don't tell me that. Don't tell me that. The truth is, I get that. I really do. And sometimes I think even I'm kind of in that category myself. But this piece of information was never intended to rock you or shock your beliefs or sway you in any way, but only hopefully to leave you saying, I've never heard that before. Hopefully you found it interesting. That's all for today. What do you think? Is this interesting? Is it entertaining stuff? Or is it stuff that should have been left alone and I just created a video that for you is borderline heretical? Or perhaps this is old news and you've known this for a long time. Be sure to let me know if you already knew this or what you think about it in the comments below. As always, I'd love to hear from you. And if you have a subject or a question you'd like me to cover in a future video or podcast, let me know. Again, I'd love to hear from you. You can put that down in the comments section below as well. And on your spiritual journey, may you ask questions, seek answers, and boldly go wherever the quest takes you. Thanks for joining us here today and being part of the SkyPilot Faith Quest community. This is a great place to ask questions you wouldn't feel comfortable or safe asking in other places. And remember, the sign of a strong faith, solid religion, or healthy spiritual journey is not certainty, but that you keep asking questions.